My father brought back a disgusting figurine from Africa, where he went on a business trip. I don't know where he got this piece of junk, probably sold right on the street as a souvenir. The figurine was covered in brown spots and had a repulsive odor. It was made of some strange wood that was easily breakable and depicted a skinny, peculiar-looking person as I understood it. It was an old man with sunken eyes, thin limbs, and protruding ribs. He stood on a pedestal with some inscriptions carved on it. After a bit of searching online, I learned that in the language of the country my father visited, it meant the third. To make matters worse, my father placed it in my room. My mind, already filled with subconscious fears and horrifying images from watching countless horror movies, couldn't handle the creepy presence of the third in my room. My already restless sleep left me almost completely. At night, I started vomiting, and blood often flowed from my nose. My nails began to peel off, and I lost a lot of weight. For a while, I jokingly attributed my ailments to the figurine, but when I was sick again, my gaze fell on it, and this thought didn't seem so incredible to me anymore. The idea came to me to find some information about the third on the internet. I found the necessary information quite quickly. It turns out there was a common legend in that country that said one leader, whose name I can't translate into Russian, had 3 sons. But he didn't give them names at birth, so they were called the first, the second, and the third. The first son died in childhood, the second was healthy and wealthy, and the third suffered from various illnesses. The legend gave rise to a tradition associated with figurines depicting these sons. If you wished death upon someone, you gave them the figurine of the first, of course, secretly from the person themselves, and if you wished wealth and health, you gave them the figurine of the second. And if you wished illness upon your enemy, you somehow had to give them the third. To lift the curse, you just had to get rid of the figurine. I cheered, not finishing the article. Grabbing the figurine, I forcefully threw it on the floor. Cracks appeared on the surface of the third, from which a foul-smelling liquid, resembling blood, began to flow. I cried out of fear and hopelessness. Overcoming my disgust, I picked up the figurine and broke it in half. A large piece of rotten meat fell out of it. I cleaned everything up and threw it in the trash, calmed down, and continued reading the article. To my horror, I discovered that it said further in black and white, according to beliefs, the figurine must be thrown away, not broken. If the recipient breaks it, the curse will haunt them for the rest of their life. I sat in front of the computer in shock, not knowing what to think. And then the doorbell rang. It must have been someone returning from home. As if in a dream, I got up and mechanically went to open the door. No one was behind the door, but lying on the threshold was a piece of rotten meat. Mike kicked the bucket in the most unremarkable way, just as he had done many other things in his short and wayward 40-year life. According to him, in the morning, after he sobered up and headed to work, the ground suddenly gave way beneath him, and he hit his head hard on the asphalt. The search for Mike didn't start right away. Knowing her husband's wandering nature, his wife only became seriously concerned on the second day. Another day passed before they found him in the computer database of the city morgue, which was closed due to the sudden onset of the weekend and the unknown to the general public state holiday. On Monday, the tearful relatives arrived at the morgue, got Mike's passport, and identified his belongings. The experienced morgue employee advised against looking at Mike because the refrigerators in the facility hadn't been working lately. Trusting her opinion, the widow signed the identification form without looking. Only on the 6th day was Mike buried in a closed coffin in the presence of numerous relatives and loved ones. A couple of days later, Mike called home and demanded to be taken out of here. It turned out that Mike had been brought to the emergency room dressed only in torn socks and panties with flowers, and he had no idea who had died in his jacket and pants. A week later, legally savvy neighbors of Mike's wife filed a lawsuit against the management of the morgue for compensation, for the material damage, for the belongings given to the church, for distribution to the needy, funeral expenses, the drinks and food consumed by voracious relatives at all the festivities, including the funeral, memorial service, and resurrection. At the same time, a statement was filed with the prosecutor's office to initiate a criminal case against municipal services, including the hospital, the police, and the management of the same morgue. Meanwhile, the capital's judiciary was once again preparing to strike a blow against the criminal cemetery business, but first decided to warm up on the outskirts. Therefore, the victim statement came in handy at just the right time, and it was promptly handed over to the head of the investigative team, Lieutenant Colombo. That's how he introduced himself one evening when he showed up at Mike's apartment. After listening to the details from the direct participants, he promised to get to the bottom of it and, just in case, asked Mike to cut off a lock of his hair and a couple of nails for a comparative genetic analysis of both deceased Mike and the one buried in his grave. Meanwhile, Mike lost his job because deceased persons are not highly regarded. At any enterprise, someone else was already hired in his place, and the HR department recommended getting a passport before resuming employment. In between restoring his civil status, Mike enjoyed telling his adventures to anyone willing to listen, earning himself a glass of port wine and a processed cheese in this simple way. He even took the most skeptical ones on a tour of his grave, raising the stakes to several bottles of cheap wine and covering the travel expenses to the burial site. A month later, Mike got a taste for his new life and became a local attraction, so when the same investigator came to him again, he fully appreciated his value as a legal case. This time, Lieutenant Colombo was slightly puzzled and astonished the victims with a new request to provide him with some item worn by Mike before his death for re-examination, preferably with traces of bodily secretions, for example, dirty underwear or a handkerchief. The request was met with indignation, and the meticulous hostess shamefully drove the investigator out of the apartment. In the yard, Mike caught up with Lieutenant Colombo and informed him that he was ready to please him with his snot, which could very well have been preserved on a handkerchief in the pocket of his work overalls. Given a bottle of port wine in advance, Mike was loaded into the prosecutor's car and taken to his former workplace. At the construction site, it turned out that Mike was right. No one had even thought of throwing out his belongings from the locker during his absence, and Mike ceremoniously handed over his dried secretions smeared on the stale handkerchief to the investigator. Before leaving Mike alone with his former colleagues and the port wine, the investigator once again personally trimmed Mike's nails and cut a sizable lock of his hair. And a week later, Mike died again, having gained life experience, and did so in his own bed. The relatives cried as usual, and following the beaten path, he was buried again. Fortunately, Mike's grave had already been vacated by the efforts of the employees of the prosecutor's office, who had exhumed the imposter. On the repeated 9th day, the almost familiar investigator arrived at Mike's apartment and found the funeral team gathered, pouring not the first bottle. According to the old custom, they got him drunk to near death and, extremely saddened, sent him on his way. And now, slightly tipsy, Lieutenant Colombo loves to tell this story at gatherings. He impresses his audience with notarized copies of examinations, showing documents with the conclusions of specialists. He sprinkles legal terms, article numbers of the Civil Code, and quotes from the Gospel. Particularly curious ones can take the worn-out papers in their hands and see for themselves that the biological samples of the exhumed body from Mike's grave, Mike's pre-death snot, as well as subsequent hair and nail clippings, belong to the same person. It was late autumn. I decided to take a walk and get some fresh air. I went out and walked through the forest. I looked up. The sky was dark with heavy, oppressive clouds. Rarely did I see wilted leaves on the bare trees. I thought about summer, about friends, about the water park, about how good I felt. But everything changed with the move to this stupid house. I was initially against the move, but you know modern parents, we move and that's it. Already when I arrived here, I didn't like the house or my new room. Then I felt like the unhappiest person. I have no friends here. I entertained myself with walks in the forest and spending time on the internet. The only good news was a trip to the old house for a week. My parents need to sign some papers and collect the remaining things. Well, and I, of course, will be hanging out with friends all week. I was completely lost in thought and suddenly realized that I was lost. The day turned out to be great. Not only was I in a gloomy mood all day, but now I was lost. Ahead of me was a small village, not quite ordinary. Smoke was coming from the chimney of only one house. I decided to ask the residents of this crooked hut. I reached this house and knocked. An old woman opened the door for me. She invited me into the house. I agreed. I was almost completely soaked from the rain. The old lady sat me down at the table. "So tell me, what brought you here?" she said. I told her I was lost. She gave me some kind of drink. She said it would help warm me up. It's a honey and tea infusion. It tasted quite good. But my legs suddenly felt weak. I fell to the floor. Before my eyes was a thick layer of ice. I wanted to swim out of there. Looked all around the ice. There were no holes anywhere. The air was almost gone. The old woman from the crooked hut was pulling me down. I woke up in the hospital. My mom was sitting next to me. She said they had been looking for me for 2 days and finally found me lying in the middle of a field. I told my mom everything about the walk, getting lost, the village, and the old lady. "Where did you say this village is located?" my mom asked. "Just beyond the forest, if you follow the path." "You're probably mistaken, dear. They found you right beyond the forest in the middle of a field. There was never any village there." "I must have imagined it while I was dreaming," I said, so as not to seem crazy. But I still wonder. I distinctly remember being at that old lady's house. Why wasn't there a village there then? I had almost forgotten about it when suddenly I received a package. Inside was a bottle. It said to warm up. I drank it. My legs became weak, and I fell to the floor. What happened next remains a mystery to me, but I remember searching for a hole in the opaque, thick ice.